To support Canada's own defence needs, we would need to be spending a lot more than 2% a long time ago. But we have trusted our alliance relationships to create the necessary environment that we didn't have to make those types of defence expenditures. And we are now in an environment where we no longer can count 100% on certainly our ally to the south. And I firmly believe that if we aren't serious about taking care of our own homeland security, the Americans will find reason to do us for it, and we will even be in a worse situation than we are right now. Supporting European security is going to be ultimately in our interest.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Monday, June 23rd, 2025.
NATO was busted until I came along. I said, everybody's going to pay. They said, well, if we don't pay, are you still going to protect us? I said, absolutely not. They couldn't believe the answer. If we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
Our NATO allies. We fully support the Article 5 commitment. But it's time for our European allies to step up. And one of the things that Secretary General Rutte said on our call was this last couple of weeks have been a real wake-up call. And I asked him, what have you been missing the last couple of years? The fact that we are going to enter into a NATO summit this June with a third of our NATO allies still not meeting the 2% minimum, a commitment they made a decade ago, literally a decade ago, with a war on their doorstep, the largest war that they're all extremely concerned about, but yet it's, well, somebody else.
Canada is revisiting all of its expenditures presently from top to bottom. Just recently, our Prime Minister announced a $6 billion new effort to secure our Arctic, Canada's Arctic. So we're working very hard now with our colleagues to implement a series of changes. We'll have much more to say about that financially.
The 76th NATO Summit convenes in The Hague tomorrow at a pivotal time for the alliance, with defense spending and alliance cohesion front and center. The summit will likely see discussions on raising collective defense spending further, potentially up to 3.5% of GDP, as well as growing interest in European defense initiatives. At the same time, the summit occurs under the shadow of U.S. domestic politics, with allies closely watching for signals about Washington's continued commitment to NATO, particularly in light of President Trump's skepticism of the alliance. For NATO as a whole, the summit will serve as a test of unity, political resolve, and the balance between transatlantic cooperation and their evolving regional defense strategies. Joining us today to discuss what's at stake for Canada and the alliance at tomorrow's summit, we're joined by Kerry Buck, Wendy Gilmour, and Vincent Rigby. Today, my colleague Claire Parsons, CDA Institute Research Assistant, will be taking on hosting duties.
I'm going to jump right into our first question, sort of a general, broad-based inquiry as to the goals of Canada's policy at the summit. So the NATO summit will be Canada's spotlighted test on its defense commitments. With its promise to reach 2% by March 2026, is Canada now aligned with the rest of the alliance? Anybody can kick us off.
Kerry, go for it.
Yeah. So, yes, Canada is finally aligned with a target for defense spending that was established as far back as 2008. So we finally made it, one of the last two to make the 2%. And the good news for NATO is that this means that all NATO allies for this year will be making the 2% of GDP on defense. Why does it matter? It matters, of course, because the security situation has changed and worsened significantly, and we actually need to spend at least that much in order to counter some of the threats that are coming at Canada and all allies. But it also matters very much because we have a particular challenge at this upcoming NATO summit, and that is helping to ensure that the U.S. stays in as long and as deep in NATO as we can manage to keep them at the table, and this will help a lot. So yes, we're aligned with other allies by promising to make the 2% this year. If we hadn't, we would have been the sole allies sitting out there in the quadrant of shame, and it would have made us extremely vulnerable with the U.S., with other allies. But I fully expect the NATO summit to come up with a much higher defense spending target. And it depends what the timeline is for that, but we will find ourselves very quickly, again, having to commit to more defense spending.
I think it's important from my perspective that we realize, I hope finally, that we're not doing this just because we want to be in good company with our NATO partners, that we're doing this solely in an externally facing interest. We're also finally catching up to doing what we should have been doing for our own defense interests, to assure our own security for some time. And that, of course, is all the more important, not only in the NATO context, but also in the context of making sure that that the U.S. does not see us as a freeloader, that we are doing what we need to do for our own security so that someone else doesn't do it for us.
I'd have to say I'd agree both with Kerry and with Wendy with their respective remarks. It reminds me a little bit of somebody chasing a bus up the street forever, finally catching the bus at the bus stop, and then the bus pulls away as you're trying to get on, and it's moved on to the next bus stop. The next bus stop's going to be 3% or 3.5%, whatever the case may be. So we're aligned for now, and we're looking good for now, but we still have a little bit of catching up to do. And Wendy's also right in terms of this is in our national interest. And the Prime Minister has stated that quite clearly, that we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, not just because it's going to please our allies. And we made that commitment. And that commitment was important, the 2%.
Yeah.
And I would say also back to 2008, I remember as a defense policy analyst in the early 2000s, if not the late 1990s, talking about 2%. So it goes back even further than that. It's not necessarily a formal commitment, but it's been out there forever. But doing this because it's the right thing to do. And it is a very, very dangerous and unpredictable world. And I think we've been a bit of a laggard, not just in terms of our NATO commitment, but just doing the right thing for Canadians in terms of protecting our interests and protecting our values. But it's still just a commitment at the end of the day. And so are we aligned? We've still got to get the money out the door. And it's very, very ambitious. And it's basically getting $9.3 billion spent by the end of this fiscal year. And all of us, I think, on this panel have had experience in trying to get money out the door and how difficult that can be. And it's been a perennial problem in the Department of National Defense, not just on the procurement side, but just generally spending that money. And this is not just about procurement. This is also about hiring people, thousands of civilians potentially to support a lot of these programs. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be really tough. So we'll see where we end up on March 31st, 2026.
I'm pretty confident that there has been huge amounts of work ongoing, certainly in the Department of National Defense and hopefully in all the partner departments, figuring out what 2% was going to look like, what projects and programs were, as they say, shovel ready, where can there be money put so that it's going to have longer lasting effect. And I mean, one of the things that I keep reminding myself and others is that it's not just 2%, oh, we're going to get this big amount of money out the door this year, but this is an ongoing commitment. I mean, that's the same amount of money next year. And so the real question is going to be looking at the capital program and figuring out how do we get our program management together and, efficient enough so that we can get real projects going quickly. And, and that worries me. It's not just the thousands of civilians that may or may not be hired. It's figuring out how do we do this differently? Are there ways to leverage other capacity? One of the things, and I think we're going to get to it later, but I'm really excited about is the idea that we're going to be looking at more multinational programs and procurements, that we will be able to work more carefully and considerately with the EU, and that we will be able to get Canadian companies working more effectively in our own interests. But Vince is absolutely right. This is not straightforward or simple.
And I think that's a really important point, Wendy. It's the year-over-year business. I think we're focused on the $9.3 billion right now. We're seeing that big figure, but this is year over year over year making this work, and especially on the procurement side, where defense has had particular problems getting money out the door. Can they meet a lot of these goals and aims moving forward? I think it's great that we're setting up a defense procurement agency. I think that's an important step. But trying to set up a defense procurement agency, and I think we've also all had experience in machinery issues around government and how difficult it is setting up new agencies. Setting this up while you're trying to get this stuff actually built and money out the door is going to be tough. So there are definitely challenges, but I'm with both of you. I think just the fact that the Prime Minister's made this commitment right before a NATO summit is incredibly, incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
Prime Minister Carney's announcement about meeting this 2% goal is immediately under the sort of spotlight that allies at the NATO summit will be calling again, like you said, Vincent, for that 3%, 3.5%. And there's conversation amongst the Prime Minister and the Department of National Defense about how they're going to meet that 2% number, be it through the investment programs for military families, childcare, healthcare, the integration of the Coast Guard. Obviously, procurement projects for national defense are incredibly hot button issues. So when Canada arrives at the NATO summit, how can Canada address these spending requests to its allies? And basically, how can Canada address the criticism of what makes this commitment different from the commitments from all the way back in 2008, and what can Canada say to its allies this time around to show that it's serious about its commitment?
And I can start off. And so, I mean, it's what's going to happen at the summit next week is not going to be Canada on the hot seat to defend its spending program. The discussion next week is going to be about having reached a commitment to 2% with firm spending plans of all of the nations to then look at what goes on from there. At the Vilnius summit, which was 2 years ago, the NATO commitment was to move to 2% as an aspiration to 2% as the floor of what was necessary to meet the alliance's capability commitments and its ambition. So the focus next week is going to be, all right, Canada, great, you've made 2%. And not just Canada, but Spain and a number of other nations that are nervous about how they move forward quickly to say, all right, now, are you getting the credible spending plans in place to move beyond 2%? I think that it's not going to be a nuts and bolts examination of where is your money going. That being said, and I firmly believe that NATO nations and frankly the Canadian public will be looking to the budget this fall, will be looking to what actions have taken place over the course of the summer to demonstrate that this is a tangible commitment and that things are actually happening.
So there are two interesting things that are going to happen at the summit. Wendy's dead right. It's not an in-depth scrutiny kind of name and shame. Oh, your spending's lower than another ally. It's not about that. It's really saying, great, we made that target we set a while ago, but it's not enough. So the current regional defense plans that have been set by Supreme Allied Commander Europe, they're the most detailed defense plans that NATO's put in place since the Cold War. And if all allies were to meet their capability targets under those defense plans, it would be roughly 3.7% of GDP across the alliance, barring any efficiencies that could be gained from pooled procurements. So right now, given the current threat level, making an agreement this coming week at the NATO summit to reach 3.5% of GDP, even that won't meet the current defense needs across the alliance. And then the other thing is that Secretary Rutte said last week, I think, that he expects Russia to be able to attack the alliance in a sustained way within the next 5 years. So the requirements are going to be even more over the next 5 years. And these are very real threats. So it's really good that collectively the alliance has met that target it's set, and it's not enough. This is going to be really hard next few years, retooling all of us across the alliance to, as Secretary Rutte said, place ourselves on a war footing. Now that sounds pretty extreme for Canadians because, we're sitting so far away. It's really not believable that there would be armies marching on Canada, naval, other people's navy, adversaries' navies coming to our shore. But it's not about that kind of threat right now, to be honest. There are all sorts of new threats that NATO and we, Canada and the Allies, aren't ready for. So there's advanced missile technology. There's drones. We don't have the counter-drone capacity. We don't have the over-the-horizon radar to understand some of the missile threats coming at us. They're what we call sub-threshold threats. So disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. So it's a whole new, much more difficult world. And that's what this NATO summit is about. Moving all of the alliance onto a footing where we can respond to those new kinds of threats and much more acute threats than we've seen for quite a while.
I think that's a really important point because everybody gets obsessed about 2% or 3 or 3.5 or 5. At the end of the day, it's about capability. It's what you can actually put out in the field. And again, going back to my younger, much younger days when I was writing some of the briefing notes for the Minister of National Defense, one of our favorite lines was percentages of GDP. Don't buy tanks or airplanes or ships. It's hard cash and it's putting the capabilities out in the field. So I think Kerry's point about the capability plans, the capability gaps are actually far more important than the percentage of GDP. But that's how it's going to play out publicly, and that's how it's probably going to play out at the summit in terms of that percentage. So first of all, what is the percentage going to be, and can you get everybody on board? And Spain looks like it's potentially thrown a spanner in the works. We'll see how that plays out. But there's this percentage, and then the time frame. When can you get there? Whether it's 2032 or something faster. I know some of the Eastern Europeans would like to see it a lot faster than that, and some others not so much. And then beyond that core of 3 or 3.5, there's this talk of maybe 1.5% to bump it up to 5%. Non-core defense capabilities, infrastructure, cyber, those sorts of things. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of debate about what goes into that 1.5%. There's already a lot of debate about what goes into the 2% and if it becomes 3 or 3.5. But the 1.5, there'll be a lot of debate. So I agree with Wendy. That's not going to be that, leaders are not going to get into that debate for a few hours next week. But that's coming. So I think the devil will be in the details ultimately. But you first of all have to get the political alignment and the political consensus. And I think Canada's got good news. So there's a lot of agreement here, too much agreement. Kerry and I were joking beforehand that we should argue a little bit more, and I'm sure it'll come. But we've got a good news story here. But I still haven't seen the details of where the 9.3 billion and whatever we're spending each year after that in terms of sustaining the 2%, in terms of what capabilities beyond the big ticket items and the platforms, what we're going to be focusing on and where some of that money is going and the proportion, et cetera, et cetera. And so, to Kerry's point about filling capability gaps, where can Canada step up and Canada can play a particularly important role is going to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, the 1.5% that is being sort of suggested to bring it up to the 5% figure, which is ultimately what President Trump had called for. But I'm a firm believer in let's not worry so much about the rhetoric that's coming out of the U.S. and let's worry more about what is it that we need and where do we want to put our money, and frankly, what is in Canada's interest to deliver. And if 1.5% can be demonstrated to go into infrastructure that has dual use capacity, man, we could spend that in a heartbeat if we started to invest in the infrastructure in the north that we really had, first and foremost for the interest of our northern communities, but then also that is a benefit in extending our in ensuring that we have the capacity to guarantee our sovereignty in the north, putting in place pipelines that go to both coasts. And you can make a very credible argument that the 3.5 expenditure on defense that might be necessary to meet the capability targets that we have committed to NATO doesn't take into account that Canada has a Pacific coast and we have real security interests and prospects for a very challenging environment off the Pacific. So, what is the capacity that we need to invest to ensure our ability to defend all three of our coasts from, as NATO's favorite saying at the moment, from seabed to space. And that could be a huge amount of investment, which is why, frankly, from both my background and my interest, I'm really keen on understanding how do we do this effectively? How do we do it in a way that builds the technology necessary to do it in a more cost-effective way than simply conventional capabilities? and a lot of the technology that we would be investing in that would allow us to ensure our sovereignty, to defend our coasts, our territories, to support our allies is present here in Canada and has not been invested in sufficiently. So let's leverage this money to get the Canadian sort of the innovation scale underway and literally off the charts. That to me would be one of the best outcomes that would have the dual purpose of, yes, meeting our security and defense needs, but also, frankly, creating the sovereign economic capacity that we need to guarantee our own security at the same time.
Well, and isn't it interesting that we're having this debate right now when the Prime Minister is talking so much about nation building exercises and Bill C-5 and getting this stuff at the door, and sort of the other pillar, strategic autonomy, and how those two reinforce one another in so many different ways. So I completely agree with you. We'll see how, if that's the number they come down to, and if that's the equation they work out, or the approach 3.5 plus 1.5, what that 1.5 is made up of. But I think Canada is positioned well, at least in terms of resources and what we need to do, but also in terms of political will right now. And we've seen the way the Prime Minister has pushed that legislation. He wants to get moving on this stuff and get moving on it fast. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff there that can be applied from a dual application perspective for defense and security.
When thinking about the capability question in combination with nation building, Canadian defense interests, all of these sort of quintessential themes that have come up in Canadian defense conversations. If you're really looking to argue, I can pivot the conversation either to the Arctic, to Ukraine, or out into the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we are spoiled for choice on contentious areas to discuss. But because we're specifically speaking about Canadian capabilities and Canadian nation building, why don't we start at home, and then we'll move sort of to those bigger foreign policy conversations. Prior to the election of Prime Minister Carney and the new sort of round two of Liberal government, the previous Liberal government had published our North Strong and Free, Canada's Guiding Defence Policy Updates centered on the Arctic. This is Canada's number one priority in terms of geopolitical defense. But most NATO allies are not Arctic nations. There are obviously a few exceptions there. Many are members of the Arctic Council. So how can Canada present its defense policy as a contribution to the alliance despite those geographic challenges?
I don't think that there really are geographic challenges per se. I mean, first of all, I was thrilled when I saw the last defense policy update come out, and there was the focus on the Arctic. For so long, I've been of the view that you focus on the Arctic and it's kind of hitting a trifecta. It's to Wendy's initial point about being in our own national interest. We take care of the Arctic because it's our sovereign territory, and we've got to do a better job up there, given everything that's been happening in that region over the last number of years in terms of climate change as a facilitator for greater geostrategic competition up there, et cetera. I mean, it's a strategic theater now in geostrategic rivalry. So it's in our own national interest. It helps us with the United States, without a doubt. The U.S. wants us to do more up there. They want us to move forward with NORAD modernization. They'd like to see us have more of a presence. So notwithstanding President Trump's comments about the Arctic and Greenland and so on, and sometimes perhaps we're going to be more in competition with them than we think, I think they're happy to see us do more up there. And then finally with NATO, that's the third circle. I know that this has been a contentious issue, and in the past when it comes to NATO engagement in Canada's Arctic, and I think, Kerry, you've been part of some of those conversations when you were ambassador, and a certain reluctance on the part of Canada to have NATO too engaged in that region for reasons of sovereignty or provoking the Russians, whatever the case may be. I wasn't on the inside on some of those conversations, but I think now there's a general sense in the alliance that the Arctic is the northern flank or the western flank, depends on how you want to look at it geographically, of the alliance, and that we need to work more closely there. So when I think of the Arctic and NATO, I don't think of it in terms of, most NATO countries aren't Arctic countries. And so it's going to be a tough sell or anything like that. I think it would just the opposite way in terms of, as you mentioned, Arctic Council states, Nordic countries, Finland and Sweden, new members of the alliance, and just the fact that the threats are emerging in that region. They're threats not to individual countries, but they're threats to the alliance writ large. That this is actually a reasonably easy sell. And so for us to say that we are focusing a lot of our capabilities, and they're not single use, right? These capabilities are multi-purpose. We can use them in all kinds of different places, but some of them can be applied specifically in the Arctic. And this is a good thing to put the Arctic at the forefront of our defense policy. I've always thought it was a bit of a no-brainer. Let's take care of our own neighborhood, but we're also taking care of NORAD's neighborhood, the United States neighborhood as well. So hopefully that will continue to play out. I think it already is. Arctic as an emerging theater, and NATO's got to up its game there, and Canada can play a leadership role. This is an area where I think Canada can really play a leadership role.
Yeah, we could. Here's what it used to look like at NATO on Arctic. We, Canada, wouldn't let NATO summit declarations use the word Arctic. Certainly not talking about our Arctic. Our Arctic was a tension-free zone. And this wasn't just about Russia, but, through the Arctic Council, we had pretty good scientific cooperation with all Arctic states, including Russia. This is pre-2014. And it was an important policy position that we continued to see the Arctic as a tension-free zone. So that word wasn't mentioned at NATO circles. And if somebody tried to mention it, we'd shut it down pretty fast, we, Canada. We and the U.S. would look to NORAD when we're worrying about security issues in our north. There was a really firm line. NORAD was NORAD, NATO was NATO, never the twain shall meet. And the NATO defense planning process focused on, so what that is it's the assignment. It's not talking about percentage of GDP spent on defense, but it's the assignment of military capability targets to each ally. And those were set largely coming from Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And those would be capabilities that Canada had to have ready in the event that the European theater was attacked, which makes some sense. And there were some kind of dispensations made for the fact that we're in North America and not in Europe. But none of the stuff that we were doing through NORAD, the exact capabilities that we're doing through NORAD or to ensure our own defense were counted in those NATO capability targets. So that was all of that policy was then. Now our policy started to shift. I can't point you to the exact moment. There wasn't a big earth-shaking announcement, but for sure by the last summit in Washington, Canada's policy had shifted. So you saw NATO Sec Gen Jens Stoltenberg coming to our Arctic to visit. It hadn't happened before because of our policy. And you saw Minister Joly, when she was foreign minister, meeting with the other Arctic allies. When she went to NATO meetings in Brussels, that wouldn't have happened before. And then as Sweden and Finland joined, we now are in a situation where all Arctic states, except for Russia, are part of NATO. So we could do a whole lot more. But what do we need to do? I think from a policy perspective, make the point that NATO is a two-way street and that North America is part of NATO territory. So there has to be some way of counting the capabilities that we contribute to that western flank of the alliance to be counted as the things that we contribute to NATO. I think that's important. The seam between Supreme Allied Commander Europe's area of responsibility and the North American space is a seam that's potentially vulnerable along the maritime front, air. And, President Trump's musings about Greenland, he's got one thing right. That area, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and then all the way over to, the seam that runs into our Arctic along our maritime boundaries, that's a point of vulnerability. And NATO has to do more to manage that seam. So we need more interoperability between what could happen in North America and what happens in Supreme Allied Commander Europe's area of responsibility. And that could turn into some very practical changes, not just to NATO defense planning process, but to the regional defense plans as well. So there's a lot of room to do some very interesting things. And it's in our interest to do it. We started to do more joint exercises with other Arctic nations under NATO banner. That's good. But I remember one NATO ally who's fairly big, but not an Arctic nation, contacting us at one point and offering to train us on Arctic warfighting. And I thought, this was a few years ago, and I thought, God, how dare they? Our former colonial masters, why would they bother to make that big? And I thought, but geez, don't we have to step up, honestly?
But to be fair to them, I have to say that what they were trying to do is amortize the cost of the base that they maintain in Norway to do winter training at. But
yeah, I know. And the thing is, our Arctic really is special. I went with the North Atlantic Council up to Kirkenes. And it was really cool because you can see Russia right there. You can see the border right there. And you can see the Norwegian, European Arctic. They have trees. They have lakes. We really do know about Arctic conditions. I think we have a lot to teach a lot of our NATO allies, but we better get our act together in order to do that. Sure, we can take a role, but it's going to take a bit.
Let's hope we're never doing maneuver warfare in our Arctic.
Yeah.
Vince, do you want to come in? I just have one.
I was just going to say, just as a quick comment, Kerry's anecdote about a certain mother country. Everybody's a near Arctic state now, right? And China's a near Arctic state, and I love the terminology. I'd like someone to define what near Arctic actually means. Maybe someone has, and I've missed that definition. But you'll be having Argentina claiming it's a near Arctic state before long. So
I don't know. I mean, if you look at where the good part of the northern part of the UK is subarctic by latitude, But take us back for 1 second, which is something I don't think both Europeans don't really understand. They don't think, and not that they don't understand, they don't think about emotionally. And frankly, a lot of Canadians don't necessarily understand when I talk to them about it. All 32 nations in NATO are NATO nations. Article 5, the collective defense, applies to all 32. If Canada were attacked in Ellesmere Island, it would be subject for Article 5. The only time Article 5 has been invoked, when the U.S. was attacked in the continental U.S., Article 5 was invoked to support collective defense, to support the actions in part that we took in Afghanistan. SACEUR's area of responsibility is Europe. It's not North America. And there's no, certainly the part of our American neighbors, they would not want SACEUR in his NATO construct to have any responsibility for homeland defense of the United States. They have other needs for that. They have U.S. Northcom, and what is a tremendously successful alliance, of course, they have NORAD, which is the only binational command that the U.S. is in that actually allows for, the Americans don't necessarily publicize this in the U.S. so much, but for foreign nationals to command American assets in the defense of the U.S. homeland. And I agree with Kerry. I had this discussion many times with NATO defense planners when I was at NATO on the international staff, that the 2% of GDP to support NATO's capability targets for any of our European NATO members, 100% of their expenditures were defending and supporting collective defense in SACEUR's AOR, whereas that is not the case for Canada. We do certain things in support of NATO defense planning in the European theater. And of course, we have our own national interests, and we are participating in a binational command to include the U.S. homeland, but of course the North American homeland. And I don't think we should be in any way apologetic not even apologetic. We should be prioritizing the expenditures we need to make in our own defense. And in fact, that's NATO Article 3, which requires nations to maintain and develop their individual capacity to resist armed attack in their own territory. So it becomes a bit of a mug's game, in my view. That is not in any way to say that the 2% is a number picked out of the air because it was convenient and easy to sell probably to support Canada's own defense needs, we would need to be spending a lot more than 2% a long time ago. But we have trusted our alliance relationships to create the necessary environment that we didn't have to make those types of defense expenditures. And we are now in an environment where we no longer can count 100% on certainly our ally to the south. And I firmly believe that if we aren't serious about taking care of our own homeland security, the Americans will find reason to do us for it, and we will even be in a worse situation than we are right now. And we believe that supporting European security is going to be ultimately in our interest, because any degradation to the security, frankly, if Russia were to attack our Eastern allies, irrespective of NATO, it would impact our security. But and I think I'm agreeing with Kerry and what we're saying, but I think collectively as Canadians, we need to do the necessary intellectual rigor, the work, to demonstrate what is it that we would need to do to truly have sovereign capabilities in our own defense, and then decide where are we prepared to work and trust our allies to work with us, achieve the efficiencies so that, not every nation has to have completely unique capabilities.
I completely agree with that. I think it always starts with the national interest and what we need to do to defend our own sovereign territory, first and foremost, for sure. I think that, I don't know how you feel about this, NATO, Kerry, but one of your NATO ambassador predecessors told me that trying to convince the Europeans that Canada's Arctic is dangerous and unpredictable is not always an easy sell, because they view the Arctic threat from Russia in particular very much a Northern Europe issue. And it's really not all that serious in the sort of the Canadian US ambit, if you want to call it that. So I think, again, that's part of the issue. Another part of the issue is, to the original point about not every NATO member is an Arctic state, but I think that we should work very, very closely with our Nordic friends and allies to really make this hum on the NATO agenda, and especially the newer members. And really, they get it, obviously. They get the threat in Northern Europe, but I think they also get the threat in our Arctic. And we've already started to work with them more closely. Kerry mentioned what the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs had been doing. We've had the CDS has hosted his counterparts in the Nordic states not too far in the past, a couple of years ago. We got to continue to work on that and beef that up and use that as an opportunity, I think, to more broadly sell this idea of the importance of the Arctic in NATO. My sense is that we've got traction already, and we're moving that way. And certainly what Stoltenberg did, and I think with the current NATO Secretary General as well, is that, they get it. The Arctic is really, really important, but we can't let our guard down. We got to continue to push it.
So if I can on this, our Arctic, there isn't going to be a direct attack anytime soon, in my view, by land, air, or sea on our Arctic territory. But it's not about that. There are different kind of threat vectors that are growing. And as the Arctic sea ice starts to melt with climate change, the risk of an attack grows higher, but it's still not the primary risk. There are missiles that can go over our territory.
That is the primary risk.
It is a primary risk, but we have to be sufficiently visible up there to assert and project our sovereignty and to deter stuff. Because what is happening now, you see Chinese quote unquote commercial vessels, which are clearly dual use, mapping our seabed. Why would they be doing this? There are critical minerals that can be accessed in our north. We need to maintain, project our sovereignty to deter conventional, unconventional, and sub-threshold interest in our Arctic that will increase the risk. So that's around Arctic. But there's a bigger point, Wendy, and I think, Vince, you agreed that first we focus on our own territory, our own homeland defense, and then we think about, based on our interests, what we should contribute to Europe. Absolutely agree, but really disagree too. The threat vectors that face all of the alliance now, things like cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, things like disinformation campaigns, things like cutting communications cables in the sea, et cetera, et cetera. The only way allies can counter those kinds of threats is by working together to look at best practices in responding, sharing technology, sharing intel. So saying, okay, we'll prioritize our own territory first, and then we'll think about if and how we work with Europe. It's not sequential like that. We absolutely need allies to work closely with allies from the beginning to counter those kind of threat vectors. Second thing is the mutual defense guarantee is to our advantage. Yes, we have some work to do to convince the Europeans that the flow of arms and support isn't just from North America to Europe, it flows in the other direction. But guess what? The only time Article 5 was invoked, post 9/11, that's what happened. NATO aerial surveillance came over from Europe to North America to patrol North American skies. It was an important symbol. So we need to double down on that idea that the mutual defense guarantee is a two-way street. And right now, with the way the U.S. is questioning the value of NATO to them and their commitment to NATO, we have a particular interest in keeping the transatlantic link and relationship as healthy as we can. So as we go off to work more with the EU to do pooled procurement with them, more defense cooperation, we need to manage that in a way that it complements NATO, feeds back into NATO, and tries to keep that transatlantic link as healthy as we can make it. Because in a way, when we're participating in European deterrence and defense, we're projecting our own borders and our own interests outward. Even a conventional attack that is really injurious to Europe from Russia, if they were to expand into NATO territory, we've already seen how economically it directly hits Canadians' economic interests, spikes in food prices from the war in Ukraine. It would directly affect our security interests as well. So it's not like either or. We've got to do both. But yes, we should calibrate what we're doing, focused on the source of the threats. And they're coming both in North America and more in Europe. That is true. And so while we focus on doing more in our own territory, we can't say, okay, well, we'll think about you later, Europe. We have to keep that NATO community and relationship alive.
I totally agree with that. And I certainly wasn't suggesting that they're mutually exclusive. I mean, we made a policy choice, I think, in the last defense update that we were going to focus on the Arctic, but it's not an exclusive focus. We still have to have an ability to operate overseas, to operate in the broader NATO area, and to work together, as you said, whether it's procurement, whether it's information sharing, whether it's interoperability, we have to do it all together at the same time, because we're going to support each other in our mutual goals. So absolutely, without a doubt. But limited resources still has to start at home, in my view. Everything needs to start with the national interest. I mean, we're part of NATO because it's in our national interest to be part of NATO. So I think those are important. But I know we're looking for a point of disagreement, but I think actually we're in agreement on this one at the end of the day. But we'll try in another area. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to pile on and agree a little bit more, I think. But just very quickly, one of the interesting things that's happening within the European space right now, of course, is like-minded individual EU countries and non-EU countries like Norway are coming together to create their own collective defense within the context of NATO and within the context of the EU. And so, probably one of the more successful initiatives right now is something called NORDEFCO, the Nordic Defense Cooperation, turning into an organization. And we need our security and defense partnership agreement with the EU in order to participate in EU rearm initiatives, which will allow us to join groups of EU nations and non-EU nations. Norway has a security and defense partnership agreement to do things that are in all of our interest. And it leverages exactly what we've just been talking about. Allows us to invest in technology, undersea technology, all sorts of things that will allow us to protect our north and collectively work in northern areas. The last thing I would just say in the north, and I cannot stress this enough, is the most effective thing that we could do to shore up northern sovereignty is create the infrastructure and provide the social supports for the communities that are there. That's the most important thing. Our sovereignty is stronger when our communities in the north are safe, healthy, secure, and prosperous. So let's hope we get that right. And if we can count it in the 1.5 percent, all the better still.
Yeah, I think there's often this mythology that if we're going to solve the problem in the Arctic, it's all going to be through the Canadian Armed Forces in terms of security, but it's got to be economic, social. There's got to be a commitment right across the board, and it's certainly even within the federal government. I mean, it's a whole of government, whole of Canada initiative at the end of the day. We can't do one without the other, and human security leads to national security, and so operating at that human level, I think, is really important, and incorporating the Indigenous component, et cetera. All of this comes together to provide for our security and to protect our sovereignty.
That's why I keep the word projecting sovereignty, because it's about presence and eyes on, and who better to have eyes on but the people who live there, honestly. So, agree.
Absolutely. Listening to your conversation about the Arctic and how it comes into this broader conversation of Canada engaging with the Europeans, and it leads me to ask about Readiness 2030, because Canada is propping itself to be a partner of the agreement. Prime Minister Carney is heading to a Canada-EU leaders meeting where he's expected to conclude a few new defense and security agreements with the EU. How can Canada promote European diversification and at the same time manage with an increasingly tense relationship with the Americans? How will doing so help the EU meet Canada's interests and vice versa in NATO? And then after this, we're going to finish up and talk about the elephant in the room, talking about the Americans.
I don't think anybody, hopefully, is in a world now. I think we've educated ourselves enough, and we've seen how all this has played out over the last number of months. Anybody's in a world where diversification means turning away from the United States completely, whether it's economically or on security and defense. We got to do both. And we've got to diversify. We got to diversify to Europe. We got to diversify to Indo-Pacific, again, both on the trade, economic, and defense security side. We have to do that. As the Prime Minister keeps on saying, we can't be selling or buying, I should say 70% of our armaments from the United States from one country. We just can't put all of our eggs in one basket. But I just finished teaching a course on Canada-U.S. relations at Max Bell, and the one of the overriding themes of the course was geography, and nobody is going to split these two countries apart geographically anytime soon. We share a continent. We are stuck with each other, and that gravitational pull southward is always going to be there. So we've already talked about some of these points on the defense side, NORAD and the Arctic. All the stuff that we do together in terms of defending North America, the border, broader issues beyond just defense, public safety, et cetera, and the opportunity to do more. We're talking about potentially within the next 30 days, a broader security and economic agreement with the United States that may or may not include ballistic missile defense, for example. So we're going to continue to do this stuff. And the Americans know this, we know this, and despite all the rhetoric that's coming out of President Trump's mouth, he understands that this is a really, really important relationship and it has to work. I also think that whatever we end up doing with the Europeans can help us with the Americans, and that it can be seen as complementary, and it can be shown to be complementary, and will in fact be complementary at the end of the day. And if we can do more with the Europeans in terms of defense procurement, and in terms of upgrading our capabilities and helping all of us as members of NATO, that's a good thing. And, President Trump saying again and again, up your game. Well, some of it's going to be with the Americans and some of it's going to be with the Europeans at the end of the day. Again, they're not mutually exclusive. So we're going to have to do both. We're going to have to do more than both. I mean, I think we can play a little bit more prominently in the Indo-Pacific in terms of defense and security. We have an Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm not sure what its status is now. We keep on talking about the defense update, like it's there and it's enshrined and it's still operable, so to speak. I'm not so sure about the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think if there was one pillar that wasn't particularly strong, it was on the security side. But we should be doing more there as well. And there are some countries that are ripe for the picking, so to speak, in terms of upping that cooperation, including with South Korea. And obviously the Aussies and New Zealand and Japan, all of whom will be at NATO next week, if I'm not mistaken. So there's lots on the table there, but I don't think we should get into a world of whatever we do with the Europeans means we can pull ourselves as far away from the Americans as we possibly can. No, I should be under that illusion. And certainly I don't think anybody at this table would be in that world. I don't think. Tell me if I'm wrong.
I think it helps that there's going to be more money to spend. So it's not about reducing what we're doing with the U.S. It's about adding more on top that we could be doing with others. I was just thinking in terms of, you mentioned, Vince, the Koreans. When I was at NATO, I co-chaired the NATO Standardization Committee, which was far more enjoyable than perhaps it sounds to some. But the core of NATO interoperability is standardization, materiel standards, training standards, doctrine, tactics, techniques, procedures, and so forth. And part of our meetings were open to NATO partners, and Korea was at the table. So, it's we can work with Europe and we can encourage other partners all to create their defense capabilities to meet the NATO standard that has been set at now 32 as NATO. And that's really important. There's, a whole different conversation about moving beyond interoperability to interchangeability, but we don't have to go down that road now. But it is absolutely crucial that I keep going back, I'm a firm believer in we have at the core a really clear understanding of Canadian interests. And Canadian interests require a strong Canadian economy and require a strong Canadian defense industrial base. Sure, we'll have more money, so we can support more economic activity in Canada, but we will never have a completely unique Canadian industrial base that will be the only source for Canadian defense capabilities. We have to work with others. And we have to get Canadian industry into European supply chains and European industry into Canadian supply chains and working with the US. And I have to say, there is no country in the world that is better equipped to understand the incredibly complex regulatory environment to do multinational procurements and work with US regulations, with EU regulations, our own, than Canada, because that's our bread and butter. US technology is, we used to say it was the DNA of a lot of our defense capabilities. So we've had to learn how to work with it. And we can help the Europeans understand that more as well. So again, I think we're really well placed, but it's about using the dollars that we're adding to our defense budget as efficiently and effectively as possible. And that means, frankly, economies of scale. It means a competitive environment. And it means looking at where our own capabilities are and understanding what we want to onshore, what do we want to have indigenously in Canada, and where are those capabilities that we're going to work with others.
Hard to agree with both of you, but there's a bigger kind of policy question and risk looming, I think. As the EU moves to spend more on defense, as Europe heads to spend much more on defense, the challenge will be to keep the U.S. security guarantee. You want to keep the U.S. security guarantee as long as possible because right now, Europe couldn't lead any kind of sustained defense if there were an attack on European territory. And I've seen different projections, but some as long as 10 years out. And you can see the gap. If Secretary Rutte is saying in 5 years, Russia could attack Europe, and other defense experts are saying Europe couldn't do a sustained defense for 10 years, that's a bad gap to have. But also the transatlantic project is useful for more than just a mutual defense guarantee, right? It's the premier international security table. It has been until very recently largely a group of like-minded states. It's helped to grow the club of democracies, et cetera, et cetera. It also helps to blunt extremes of state behavior and give you a ready table of trained and interoperable allies to not just fight with, but to deter with. So you want to keep that transatlantic project alive, I would think. So that's the challenge. I see 2 points of potential risk or 2 things to watch for. One, I'm curious to see as more countries, more non-EU allies reach out and do more pool procurement with the European Union, what's going to be the place of U.S. industry in that pooled procurement. At a certain point, there's going to be a negative impact on the U.S. defense industry, and that Donald Trump pushing for 5% of GDP spent on doesn't necessarily mean more money spent in the U.S., and that penny's going to drop at some point soon. But the larger issue is, how does that European pillar work inside NATO? In the olden days, like 2 years ago, France has been talking about strategic autonomy for a while, and that was code for Europe getting its own defense decision-making capacity, much more capabilities, and maybe NATO, but, we're not as focused on NATO. And that's been a French thing for a long time. That was my interpretation of strategic autonomy, and I'm not alone in that. Well, maybe the full-scale invasion of Ukraine cleans some of that up. EU, maybe. They understand that the proper lane for the European Union right now is to focus on capabilities, and that NATO's the decision-making body. But you can see the challenge here, NATO a consensus body, and the U.S. sitting there with a position on Russia that doesn't match. So what happens? What happens over the medium to long term? Is there a European pillar inside NATO that preserves consensus decision-making? If that happens, maybe Canada will be okay and maybe NATO will be okay. Or is the end game EU defense? And that leaves us in a different position. We're an island North America, and we could end up being much more reliant on the US than we want to be rather than less. That's not good. Or is there something outside of it that devalues NATO that we can work our way into, an intergovernmental coalition or something? I'm not making stuff up here, but I think I'm not the only one thinking about these possibilities. And I think for us to assume that NATO will continue as NATO with the transatlantic link where we can somehow sub in for the US or deal with them that way and still keep NATO as a club of friendlies, we need to work to make that happen. So that's the challenge. We have to have that longer term strategic policy thinking in place as we deal with those very quick, needed transactions with European Union and non-EU European allies to diversify our defense relationships.
I agree with that to an extent. I mean, I do agree with that. I would just note that there is more divergent opinion within the EU than perhaps we give credit to. I mean, the Nordic nations, the Northern Europeans, those that feel themselves most directly threatened by Russia, have their eyes firmly set on maintaining the strength of the transatlantic alliance, maintaining the strength of the U.S. commitment to NATO collective defense. They are probably as or more worried about countries like Hungary, like the rise of Russia-friendly right-wing movements that we've seen in some of the recent local elections. I could see us. I mean, I don't want to do doom and gloom scenarios. I've been sitting here at the Canadian Forces College for the last few months. We've been doing these exercises in strategic foresight and trying to imagine different horizon lines and worst case scenarios. And there is a worst case scenario, in my view, that the EU breaks up because they are unable to reach. And it's not, I mean, some of their decisions are not consensus making, or the security and defense policy is, but they're unable to reach a consensus on basic fundamental issues, like, for example, their relationship with Russia and how to engage with Ukraine. And there could be different alliances, which then come as a result of that. And our like-minded community is still very present in certain nations in Europe. And so, I agree with Kerry, our goal and our objective coming into this next NATO summit in The Hague, and frankly, the European summit that immediately precedes it, is as much as possible the cohesion of these bodies and our ability to respond to the threat which is posed by Russia, the looming threat which might be posed by China and elsewhere. We can pivot to the Indo-Pacific, but it's not just about the United States. There are other issues with the consensus around these issues that exist within Europe.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Good point.
I would agree with that as well. I just want to come back to a couple of points that Wendy made earlier, just in terms of, I mean, if you look at that $9.3 billion that was rolled out a couple of weeks ago, and a big chunk of that was part of a defense industrial strategy, diversification, homegrown industry, and all that sort of stuff. To me, that's potentially the most important component of the whole package, getting our act together. And it's been a long time coming, and I know that people are working hard inside T&D to get that out the door. But in terms of not just what we can do with allies, whether it's in Europe or the Indo-Pacific region or anywhere else for that matter, but what we can do at home and how industry can work more closely with the government in moving forward on a lot of these issues. It's really, really critical. But it's what we can do at home, what we can do with the Europeans, what we can do with the United States, but it's also what we shouldn't do. And I think we got to also be careful of do no harm as much as we possibly can. And so we haven't heard, we were saying before we came on air, we hadn't heard about the F-35 in a while, but don't do anything preemptive or silly in terms of ticking the Americans off. And so I'll go out on a limb here and say, just be careful on certain files right now. And that would include the F-35. Don't do anything silly. If suddenly President Trump says something, as he's wont to do, that gets up the prime minister's nose, something goes south, the 30-day deadline comes and goes, and more tariffs are slapped on steel and aluminum by the Americans, don't have any knee-jerk reaction and reach out and do something like that. That will do harm, and we got to be very careful, in my view, in that respect.
We've lived that story once already, and my view, wasn't the right decision to pull away in the 2013, 2014 under two governments ago. And yeah, no, I agree with you 100%, Vince. And one of the things that the NATO Summit is going to do, and I maybe do a little bit of a cheer out for my former colleagues in the NATO defense investment world. We came out in Vilnius with a defense production action plan, which was the first time NATO had looked at these issues, frankly, since the end of the Cold War. There's been tremendous work done since I left, maybe because of it, to look at what that's going to develop in terms of production planning, defense industrial activity, and frankly, commitments that we should see ideally in the Hague Summit declaration or in decisions taken at the Hague Summit to further collaborate on industry, production, collective multinational procurements, on sharing our procurement planning, because frankly, adding all the more money in the world into the mix as it is right now will not produce the capabilities that we need collectively across NATO. So we've got to be in a position to use this money wisely and well. And I think all of the nations committed last year to sharing their defense industrial plans by this time this year. And I know that our former colleagues in national defense are working as hard as they can to finish up Canada's own defense industrial strategy. I was thrilled to hear it mentioned in the speech from the throne as a particular priority. I just like to see what it's going to say, and I'd like to see it implemented. So there's the challenge, and there go all the summer vacations for our friends in D&D, Public Services, Procurement Canada, and Industry Canada.
Absolutely.
I want to finish here because we started to touch on it at the end. Canada cannot step away from the Americans. It is essential that Canada diversifies itself with Europe. It's essential that Canada develops its own defense industry to be self-sufficient. It comes back to ruminate on that question that I think plagues Canada as much as our European allies, in that the Americans are no longer predictable. and that their consistency and reliability has become a pretty significant issue in majority of NATO allies' defense policy. That the American position on Ukraine has been shifting in surprising ways, and we do not see the same aid to Ukraine that we did at the beginning of the invasion. We see President Trump leave the G7 meeting early to manage the Israel-Iran crisis in the Middle East. And so my final question for you today is this NATO summit, a piece of it at least, about managing President Trump here at the summit? And what does success look like for Canada and its allies? And what happens if they fail?
Yuri? Yeah.
These are big questions.
So sorry, guys. Really.
The summit agenda is all about managing President Trump.
Absolutely.
Usually they're 3-day affairs. There's going to be at least 2 meetings of the North Atlantic Council. One to talk. Yeah, at least 2 full meetings of the North Atlantic Council, usually a leaders' dinner where they would talk about geopolitical situation, major threats, etc., and other things, meeting of the NATO Ukraine Council, sometimes NATO Georgia, meeting with outreach partners, usually the Indo-Pacific 4, etc. So multi-rank. What they're doing this time is a social dinner among leaders with the King and Queen of the Netherlands, and then one meeting of the North Atlantic Council that goes, I think, from 10:30 till 1. Might even stretch to a 2-hour-long meeting, and that's it. And I expect the discussion there to focus almost exclusively on defense spending. I know they might talk about other things at the table, but I know that there's going to be one big decision coming out of the summit on defense spending on a 1-page communique. And usually it's multi-pages, takes months and months to negotiate. It's going to be 1 page, 4 to 5 paragraphs, mostly on defense spending, and watch whether there's a kind of affirmation of the mutual defense guarantee of Article 5. And my guess is that's going to be it. So why? I was at President Trump's first 2 summits, and we've seen from the G7, and we saw from the G7 last few, that when he was president, and from NATO summits, he is bored and he needs to leave early. And he has one thing that he's focused on at NATO, it's spending, and that's the menu item that is being served up. Now, Wendy and Vince, and I made the point too, this is not only about managing President Trump. We actually have to be doing this for our own security interests, but it's also about managing the Americans, because it is in our collective interest to not have an open rift with the U.S. at the summit. It just is. It's in our bilateral interest too. So it is what it is. And I actually think it's quite smart tactically to focus in that direction. And the fact is that the other work is going to keep on going. There's going to be a separate meeting of defense industry the day before. There's going to be a meeting of foreign ministers in the NATO Ukraine Council. NATO defense ministers and foreign ministers throughout the year can take all the decisions that are needed, and the chiefs of defense staff meeting too. All the decisions that are needed can be taken throughout the year without forcing a whole menu of decisions up to the leaders level. So there'll be one big decision. It's important. It's okay. For those bemoaning the fact that they won't do the full communique, it doesn't matter.
I was going to say, if I can give President Trump credit for anything, if we have a short, sharp communique and we get rid of the 80 paragraphs that we certainly did the last one I went to, which was Vilnius, I mean, that's a great thing, because very few people ever read it other than the people who negotiated it. And what is clear is that the NATO has a real need for clear strategic communications to any potential adversaries. And that communication has to be alliance cohesion, the fundamental belief and confidence in our collective defense mandate, and frankly, the commitment of each of the nations to stepping up and doing what's necessary to get their own houses in order and to bring those capabilities to the NATO table. And if you can do that in a few lines, and I agree wholeheartedly with Kerry, it is important for the U.S. to demonstrate that that's where they still are as well.
I totally agree. I think that we have to accept that when it comes to success at major international summits that involve President Trump, the bar has been lowered significantly. And so I go back to the term I used before with respect to the Canada-US relationship, do no harm. And so I said this before the G7 summit as well. What you want to come out with is no major rifts, no blow-ups, no nasty tweets. Can't guarantee that. No nasty verbal exchanges. If you can get away with that, I think that's a really good thing. And I think to a certain extent, we saw that play out at the G7, where I think Prime Minister Carney did an extremely, extremely good job of handling him and managing the summit as a whole. Yes, the president did leave, but we think ostensibly for a good reason. I'm not so sure if it was just about managing the Middle Eastern conflict, especially when he's now announced that actually he'll make a decision in 2 weeks. I don't know what the urgency was to go back to Washington, but that's just my view. There also happened to be a certain Ukrainian president there who didn't seem to want to talk to, but we don't have to get into that. But bottom line, if you can come to some kind of a consensus on future spending, I don't know if they'll nail that or not. Kerry and Wendy probably in a better position to judge that than I am. But for me, it's Article 5. If we can come out and say, yeah, we're all still there, hands clasped, we're still there on Article 5. Collective defense, that's huge. No blow-ups, no fireworks, no tantrums. Thumbs up, 2 thumbs up. It's a success as far as I'm concerned.
But it's worse if you ask the question. It becomes part of the storyline, and you can't manage to negotiate it into the communique, and that becomes the storyline around the summit. It actually does more damage to the collective mutual defense guarantee than not asking the question at all. Which is why I think avoiding a NATO Ukraine Council, avoiding language on Ukraine or Russia is the smart thing to do. Don't ask the question if you don't know or you don't like what the answer is going to be.
And I totally agree with Wendy in terms of the shorter communique. The public servants, the NATO ambassadors will be probably crying tears of joy. I never did a NATO summit. I did 3 G20 declarations. And I swear to God, I didn't sleep for 5 nights, and they're just awful trying to put together. So I can only imagine what it's like at a NATO summit. They're not easy. I did some of that work back in Ottawa, but you guys are at the coalface. They're not fun.
Yeah. But they do serve a purpose.
I know.
And unity and blah, 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 blah. So I'm not as down on them, but that's also because I spent 25 of my 30 years as a diplomat negotiating multilateral agreements, and B, the ambassadors don't negotiate it unless there's some really hard point, and it's our poor deputy ambassadors who have to do it.
Joining me today, Vincent Rigby, Wendy Gilmour, Kerry Buck on what's at stake next week at the NATO Summit. Thank you so much for joining me on Expert Series. What a fascinating episode. Really touched on just about everything at the forefront of the Canadian mind for foreign affairs and defense. Thank you so much for your time today.
A pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday, but we'll be taking a bit of a break this summer and releasing 1 podcast a week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.